This week's Torah portion is Shelach Lecha, and the main topic is Moses sending the 12 spies into the land of Canaan to check it out. And of course, 10 of them come back with a report that while the land is beautiful and fertile, the people there are giants and monsters, and there's no way that we will be able to conquer it. Two of the spies, mainly Caleb, but also Joshua, they say God's got us this far, he'll get us through the rest. And the people basically rebel, and ultimately at that point God is disgusted, and the people are punished for each day that they traveled in the land to spy it out. There would be 1 year of having to remain in the Sinai, in the wilderness. Basically, the idea was that it would only be the next generation, not this one, who would be able to enter the land. So what I've got in my mind, being sent off to check out this vast new land that stands before them. And historically, I remember the story of President Jefferson sending Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery expedition to check out the western part of the United States. And that becomes one of the key moments in our history, where they make it all the way to the Pacific, and they're looking for a Northwest Passage, and they come back with geographic and scientific information, and it's a critical moment in American history. And I'm imagining that Joshua, instead of Lewis and Clark, we've got Joshua and Caleb or Caleb. And instead of the 10 other spies, we've got the Corps of Discovery. Okay, so here's what I imagine. By the way, before Joshua and Caleb and the others are sent off into the land, we are reminded of that there were 12 tribes, 12 spies, one from each of the tribes. So the names that we're going to reference here are the actual names of these 12 spies. So here's how I imagine this situation. Shamua ben Zakur looks around and he says, this place is so different than Egypt. No big rivers like the Nile, but lots of wadis. There's plains and hill country, mountains and deserts. Joshua says, it is truly a land flowing with milk and honey, just like Moses always said, with milk of goats and the honey from dates. How blessed we will be once we settle here. Igal ben Yosef says, we counted 7 species of produce, grapes and pomegranates, olives, figs and dates, wheat and barley. And of course, those are known as Shivat Hamimim, the 7 species that are particular to the land of Israel. But then we begin to see a turn. So far, the first 3 spies say, wow, look at this. Palti ben Rafu, says, did you see the size of the grape clusters? They're huge. And Gadiel ben Sodi says, but the grapes are that big because the people are so huge. So this is the critical moment when things turn. Gadi ben Susi says, they're giants. How will we ever be able to overcome them? Amiel ben Gamali says, they will crush us like grasshoppers. Setur ben Michael adds, and the cities are fortified with thick walls, will never be able to conquer them. Nachbi ben Vofsi says there are Anakites, Amalekites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and Canaanites. Geuel ben Machi adds, they will devour us, we're doomed. Shaphat ben Chori adds, I say, let's head back to Egypt. And then Caleb ben Yefuna says, quiet down. I say, let's go up to this land. God took us out of Egypt. He brought us through the Sea of Reeds. He fed us manna in the wilderness. He gave us water in the desert. He enabled us to defeat the Amalekites, and he will help us take possession of the land of Canaan. We shall overcome any and every obstacle we face, for God is with us. Ultimately, the people are freaked out. They believe the 10 and not the 2. And we're told in the same parsha that after God decides the punishment, that only 2 people from that generation will be able to enter the land. And they are the 2 good spies, Caleb and Joshua. Joshua, of course, will take over for Moses and lead the people in. And Caleb will become one of the key leaders as they make the transition into the land of Canaan, soon to become the land of Israel. So we then move to chapter 14 in the book of Numbers. And here I'm imagining that when God, the way that the story is played out here in our Parsha, God says, do this. The people spy, they come back. The 10 spies give the bad report. Everybody says, we don't want to go. We want to go back to Egypt. And God says, I've had it. They're going to be punished. But I'm imagining from all the cop shows and lawyer shows that there was really a kind of a trial. And so here's what I see. Moses, sort of playing the judge, says, has the Lord reached a verdict? And God, who is playing the jury here, I have. And then Moses says, will the defendants please rise? God says, I hereby sentence you for the crimes of faithfulness. In this wilderness your carcasses shall drop. Of all of you who have muttered against me, not one shall enter the land. Your children will I allow to enter the land. Your children shall roam the wilderness for 40 years, suffering for your faithlessness, until the last of your carcasses is down in the wilderness. You shall bear your punishment for 40 years, corresponding to the 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. Bailiffs, take them away. And of course, at this point, the defendants, basically the entire generation, say, no, oh God, no! A scuffle breaks out. Pushing, shoving, punches are thrown. People are knocked down. The defendants move towards the doors of the courtroom. Moses bangs the gavel again and again. Moses screams, order in the court. There will be order here. We've all seen, whether in actual courtrooms or whether a fictional thing, where just at this moment, instead of the defendant now, adjudged guilty, is taken away by the bailiff. We've all seen the cases where he jumps on the table and screams and yells and tries to break free. So a defendant jumps up onto a chair, another one onto a table. Defendant number one screams out, Na'aleh, we will go up to the land. So here's the irony. This was a people that just before had said, we're not going there. We don't want to go into Canaan. There's giants there. They'll eat us alive. Now when God says, you will not go into the land, all of a sudden the people say, you can't tell us what to do. We're going into the land. So the first one says, we will go up. Defendant number two screams, Chatanu, we were wrong. We will go to Canaan now. Defendant number three screams, El Rosh Hahar, head for the hills. Defendant number four, we will not die here in the desert. Defendant number five, Ha'apilu, we defy this sentence. That word, ha'apilu, is the word used in the Torah reading. And Rashi tells us ha'apilu means no, we will be strong, we will be defiant. What's interesting is that in the Torah reading, the word ha'apilu is we will defy God. In modern Israeli history, the Ma'apilim were the Jews who defied the British white paper and tried to sneak into the land of Palestine then, the land of Israel, even though the British say no more Jews coming in. Defendant number six screams out, everyone, join us. Moses, still trying to gain order in his courtroom, bangs the gavel. Order in the court. Stop. Do not go up or you will be felled by the sword. You turned against God and God will not be with you. So we can imagine that in a modern courtroom drama, if the defendants judged guilty jump up on the table, head for the doors, fight and punch and scream and yell, eventually the bailiffs are going to use violence to try to subdue them. And here we find out that Moses, as the judge, is warning the people, if you go through that door, if you don't stop and accept your punishment, you will be felled. And of course, that's exactly what happens. The people, told that they now have to spend 40 years in the wilderness, refuse to accept it, and they head directly for the land of Canaan. And what happens? Once that they're there, they're met by the local tribes who defeat them, and the people, eventually, the Israelites, come back, tail between their legs, defeated and now accepting of the judgment and the punishment. So we're told they make a break towards the hill country in the land of Canaan. They make their escape, but as soon as they come over the crest of the hill, they are met by Amalekites and Canaanites and are brutally cut down by the enemy and killed. The Israelites are in shock from the scene in the courtroom, from the death of those who tried to go up to Canaan, and from the harsh sentence that had fallen on all of them. So the next story that we read about comes at the very end, and I want to read from the Torah, the translation, and then give you my interpretation. So at the end of Shelach Lecha, we read this. Once, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they came upon a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him as he was gathering wood brought him before Moses, Aaron, and the whole community. He was placed in custody, for it had not been specified what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man shall be put to death. The whole community shall pelt him with stones outside the camp." So the whole community took him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So stop for a minute and think about this. Here's a guy who's apparently working on Shabbat. What's the work? Gathering wood. My guess is that there was not just wood here and wood there for him to pick up and carry. To gather wood, he probably had to cut down trees, cut them into pieces that he could carry. So there probably was a good deal of physical exertion and labor that was involved. From the rabbinic point of view, even carrying the wood, in the public domain, carrying is one of the 39 labors that's prohibited by the Mishnah and by the rabbis in the 2nd, 3rd century. So here this guy is found gathering wood. And they know this is wrong. They don't know what the punishment is. God says, kill him. And of course, the death penalty was performed by stoning. Everybody takes a rock, put him in the middle, and he's hit with hundreds of rocks until he's dead. This is pretty harsh stuff. And, we're not talking about a murderer. We're not talking about a rapist. We're not talking about even a blasphemer. We're talking about somebody who was gathering wood on Shabbat. And the punishment, it's capital punishment. He's executed. Again, if we stop and we think about this, this is pretty difficult for us to accept. Look, the truth of the matter is that today most Jews are not observant of the laws of Shabbat. And most Jews today probably do stuff that may even be worse than simply gathering wood on the Sabbath. And, we don't even think twice about it. And here the Torah is telling us that sin is a crime worthy of execution. What do we make of this? And what do we make of a God who decides you break Shabbos, you gather wood, you're killed? Does this tell us about how primitive things were 3,000 years ago? Does this tell us that maybe it's just a story to scare people into observance? You don't want to mess around with breaking Shabbos. Because remember that story in the Torah, right? Whether it happened, whether it didn't happen, people read this story and they say, I'm not going there, And perhaps by scaring us into compliance with the laws of Shabbat. So that's what's going on. As I read this story, again, to me, really? Killing people for breaking Shabbos, for gathering wood? I wanted to know not so much God's motivation, but maybe the motivation of this guy. He was with the Israelites when they heard Zachor et Yom HaShabbat v'kadshehu. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The people were told, even before the 10 Commandments, that you do not go out on Shabbat to collect manna. A double portion will fall on Friday so that you don't have to go out and work and collect on Shabbat. And here, this guy knew that. This guy was at Sinai when the 10 Commandments were given. And the 4th commandment, to remember the Sabbath day, he knew all the rules, and yet he breaks them. Why? What was he thinking? Who was he? Why was he doing these things? So that's what interested me, and I came up with 3 possible explanations of who he was and what he was doing. And maybe that will give us some insight into why God was so strict. So here's the story. Once, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they came upon a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. So the whole community took him outside the camp and stoned him to death. And the gatherer says, "My daughter was sick. She was shaking. Her body was freezing cold. I had to find a way to warm her up. I went to get wood to make a small fire in our sukkah. What was a father to do?" That's pretty heartrending to think that that's why he was gathering the wood, and nevertheless, he was executed for that. The prosecutor, in the meantime, says, "The law of the Lord is perfect. It cannot be violated. It is not conditional. It is absolute. There are no excuses. There are no exceptions. This man broke the law, and he must pay for his crime. He must become an example to others. I demand the death penalty." So it's almost as if we have echoes of Inspector Javert, and who says, "I don't care why Jean Valjean stole the bread. You know, he had a niece who was starving, and he went to feed his hungry family." Irrelevant. He broke the law. The law is supreme, and there are no excuses and no exceptions. So that's one way to understand who the gatherer was and why the punishment was so strict. Once you make one exception, the law will fall apart. Nobody will follow the law. But here's another possibility. The gatherer says, "Saturday is my only day off. There are things I need to take care of, and there's no free time during the week. Were we not brought out of Egypt so that we could be free? Shall I now be enslaved to another taskmaster, the law? No one will tell me what I can do and when." So an interesting perspective. It's not just about God and following God's law. It's about freedom. Isn't the essence of why we're here in the first place because we were slaves then and now we are free? And here's a very big difference in 2 opinions. America, it's all about you're free, you can choose what you want to do. But the Jewish view is you're free from the oppression of Pharaoh, and you are now obligated, instead of worshiping and obeying Pharaoh, to worship and to obey God. So freedom is the freedom to follow the laws that we choose, not that somebody else chose for us. But that's not good enough for the gatherer. He's a sort of a libertarian. He says, you're going to tell me what to do? I choose not to be religious. I have that right. The prosecutor says, "And it's everyone else's day off too. Yet you're up at 6 a.m, cutting down trees, chopping up wood. You wake everyone else in the neighborhood. You show no consideration for anyone but yourself. You're part of a community, and you must show respect to the people you live with. I warn you, the day will come when your neighbors will have had enough, and on that day, they will take the law into their own hands, and they will deal with you in their own way." Listen, if you've ever been woken up on a Saturday or a Sunday morning by the landscaper with the leaf blower, sometimes you're probably wishing that that guy would get the death penalty, right? Bothering you, making all that noise, waking you up on the weekend. Well, the gatherer says, no, I'm free. I can be religious. I can choose to be not religious. And the prosecutor says, it's not about God. This prosecutor says, it's about, you don't care about your people. You've gone out chopping wood. You're disturbing your neighbors. Your neighbors don't want to put up with this. You have no respect. Forget about God. You have no respect for the people that you live with. Okay? But here's a third possibility. Okay? The prosecutor, we'll switch the way the story goes this time, says, we have testimony from several co-conspirators that you were engaged in making weapons out of wood, spears, bows and arrows, clubs, in order to lead a revolt against Moses with the intent of taking the people back to Egypt. How do you plead? And the gatherer says, I deny nothing. Death to tyrants. So think about the gatherer. What was he doing? First story here, his daughter is sick, she's cold, he wants to make a little fire for her. Second story is that it's his weekend, he wants to, maybe he's going to barbecue, he needs some wood to make a little fire, he wants to enjoy himself. But he's told, no, you got to follow the rules of God, not the rules of you. And then finally, a third interesting use of the wood. The wood was to make clubs and arrows and bows and weapons, right? And spears. Why? Because of a rebellion against Moses. So here we're in the Parsha of Shelach Lecha, in the very next portion of Korach that we'll read in a week from this Saturday. We read about such a rebellion, about Korach and his 250 followers who were trying to depose Moses. So I'm imagining, since this comes at the end of Shelach Lecha, and then the next passage is the beginning of Korach and the rebellion, maybe this guy was out not for his poor daughter, and not because he wanted to make a barbecue for himself on the weekend, but maybe he was preparing weapons for Korach and the others in this revolt that was going to take place against Moses. So there, I'm tying those things together. So there we have three possibilities. Do we feel any better about the penalty, the execution that took place? Certainly we don't feel better if he was doing this for his sick daughter. If he was doing this because he wanted to make a barbecue and he needed to do some woodworking around the house and he chose to do it on Saturday, I don't feel as bad as I did with the daughter story. But you don't execute a guy because he goes to Home Depot and picks up some things so that he can do work around the house. The third one, though, if this indeed, the wood gatherer, if he was part of the rebellion, then certainly I think we could understand where the notion of capital punishment comes in, because what was involved here was a coup, an attempted coup, and it was stopped before it could even start. One other thing that I want to tell you is that immediately after the execution, we read the following, and it's perhaps because of the sin of the wood gatherer, and the execution that this next paragraph comes. Listen to what immediately follows after they stoned him to death, as the Lord had commanded Moses. The Lord said to Moses as follows: "Speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout the ages. Let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe at each corner." So in other words, the response of God after the execution to this sin of the wood gatherer who was breaking Shabbos, the response of God at that moment was, people need to put tzitzit, fringes, on their clothing so that there will be a constant reminder about the laws so that they won't break the laws. Every time we recite the Shema, there are 3 paragraphs: Shema v'Ahavta, and then the V'hayim Shemoa, and then Vayomer Adonai el Moshe Lemor, Daber el Bnei Yisrael v'amarta aleihem v'asu lahem tzitzit, right? The fringes that we wear on the corners. So where does that come from? When we read it in the Siddur, we take it out of context, and it's simply the Shema, and here's the reward and punishment for observing the laws of God, and here's a way to remember the laws of God. Wear a talit, wear the fringes. But if we go back, and from the Siddur, where the paragraph comes out of context, if we go to the Torah, to the Chumash, and we read it in context, it comes as a response to the wood gatherer who broke Shabbos. And this was a warning to people. You see what happened to him? I don't want to have to do that ever again. Therefore, all of you will wear fringes. The fringes, remember when people used to tie a string around their finger? Sometimes you put a rubber band, around your wrist as a way of remembering something that you don't want to forget. So too, that's what the tzitzit were. And that's why people wore them, so that they could be seen. It says, Uritem oto, you shall see them, Uzachartem, and then remember the laws that God gave you. Okay, so now we come to the Haftorah. The Torah reading, the majority of it, deals with the spies. The 12 spies sent off by Moses to check out the land of Israel. Doesn't end up good, and the people are forced to spend 40 years in the wilderness. The Haftorah picks up the story exactly at that moment, 40 years later. The whole generation has died off, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses is gone. Joshua has now taken over. We're reading from the book of Joshua, which immediately follows the book of Deuteronomy. And here's how it starts, our Haftorah. Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim, saying, "Go, reconnoiter the region of Jericho." So they set out. They came to the house of a harlot named Rahab, and they lodged there. So the first place, when they crossed from the east bank of the Jordan, they crossed the Jordan River, and eventually the very first place that the Israelites were going to come to was the Canaanite city of Jericho, of Jericho. So Joshua is planning to bring the people over and to attack the city, but he needs to know what awaits us. Is it fortified? How many people do they have? I got to prepare for this siege and this battle. So what does he do? He does a similar thing to Moses. He sends spies. But here's the interesting thing. Joshua remembers Moses sent out the leaders of the 12 tribes. I was one of them, Joshua says. And there were 12 of us. We came, and then we gave our report in front of everybody. And it didn't turn out so well. 10 guys said, bad idea. Me and Kalev said, we can do it. Let's go. But at that point, the people heard the report, and the people decide, we're not going. So Joshua, 40 years later, remembers, and he learns the lessons, the mistakes that Moses made. So instead of just picking 12 people who represent the people, what Joshua does is he picks 2 people who are friendly to himself, right? Maybe the number 2 because he remembers it was just him and Kalev who brought back the good report. And ultimately, these 2 are not going to report to the people. They're going to report just to Joshua, right? And Joshua will tell the people what's going to be. It's not going to be left up to the people to vote and to make a decision. So they sneak across the Jordan. They come to the town of Jericho, and they go to an inn. And they find that there's a woman there who is named Rachav. She's a Canaanite. She's from the town of Jericho. Now, she's called an Isha Zonah. Here it's translated as a harlot. And indeed, the word Zonah in modern Hebrew, one of the worst curses that you can call somebody in Israel is to say, to call them a ben zonah, a son of a whore. Okay? Here, she is a isha zonah. But there are those who say, this doesn't mean, prostitute as we understand it. The word zonah may come from the very same root as the word mazon. Zonah, mazon. Mazon, from Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals. Mazon literally means food. In Queens, there's a takeout place called Moazon, and they get their name from Birkat HaMazon, the idea of the place that provides food. So here, Rachav was an Isha Zonah. Doesn't mean she was a prostitute, or does it mean she was an innkeeper? And where would 2 strangers go if they have to stay, in town? You go to the Marriott. And she was running the Marriott. She was the innkeeper. So it's also possible that where would somebody go to find a prostitute in those days? Possibly at the inn. That could be the place where prostitutes hung out and waited to do their business. So think of all the Westerns we've seen and the saloons and the girls who were upstairs. So maybe this is a similar thing as well. So here's the story as I envision it. The 2 guys come back and they tell Joshua what happened. Joshua says, I don't understand. Why should we trust this Rachav woman? Spy number 1 says, she took us in. She hid us in her house. She lied to the king. The king said, word is that there are foreigners who are around. You know anything about it? And she said, well, they were here, but they left. They went that way. Long time ago. They're gone. And starts a wild goose chase, and in doing so, Rachav saved the 2 spies. She sent the soldiers on a wild goose chase, and she helped us escape. She had several opportunities to turn us in, but she didn't. I think we can trust her. Joshua wants to know, but why should she turn against her own people? Right? Why would she help us, the Israelites? Spy number 2 says, from what we heard, the people in Jericho know we're coming. They've heard about our defeat of Sihon and Og. Those were two of the kings, the Amorite, the king of Heshbon in the wilderness. And word got out that the Israelites are strong and they're on the way. And they're worried that the same thing will happen to them in Jericho. And she's got these 2 elderly parents and brothers and sisters. She wanted a promise from us that we would spare her family when we conquer the city. So already that begins to make sense. Why is she being a traitor to her own? Because she understands that the Israelites are going to win. She knows which way the wind is blowing, and she wants to be on the victorious side, even though from the point of view of Jericho, that might make her a traitor. Joshua says, you said she was a zonah, a prostitute. Can we really trust such a woman? And the first spy says, among the Canaanites, there are innkeepers who provide lodging and food. Sometimes there are also women there who will sleep with a man for an additional fee. While the Canaanite language is similar to Hebrew, I can't really say if their word zonah has the meaning of food provider or sex provider. Okay, so again, an interesting point. The Israelites who speak Hebrew, Canaanite is similar, probably, another Semitic language, but words could have different nuances. So the same word, are we really sure that what in Hebrew means a whore, in Canaanite means the same thing, or could it mean something different? You know, for us, zonah, from the idea of somebody who goes astray, right? Or does it come from the word mazon, meaning food provider? Spy number 2 says, while we were there, we didn't see any evidence that she was sleeping with men for money. But even if it turns out that that's what she does, I got the feeling that Rahab saw the coming victory of the Israelites as a chance for her to get out of that business and to begin a new life. Maybe that's why she was so willing to turn on her own people. In their eyes, she's the lowest of the low. To us, she's a heroine who saved our lives and paved the way for our victory. So to go from the bottom of society to be a hero among the Israelites, maybe that's what her motivation was. And Joshua says, the entire battle for Jericho and our future in the land of Canaan depends upon this one woman. I just hope you're right about her. And ultimately, we read that the 2 spies had told her, listen, here's the deal. Don't say anything about us. And when we come, we want you to tie a red string, a red rope outside of your window, so we know, our people will know where you live, and our people will spare you. It's almost reminiscent of the red blood that was placed over the homes of the doorposts of the Israelites in Egypt. So they were spared. And here, she's almost becoming a surrogate Israelite by, instead of blood of a lamb, it's a red cord or a red string or a red rope that's placed, that's a sign, spare the person, pass over this house, and don't harm her or anyone who's with her. And indeed, that's what happened. And she becomes a part of the Israelites. And in fact, there seems to be a subset, a clan, whether they're converts or whether they were just people who never converted but who joined their fate with the Israelites. We read later on, 100, 200 years later, about the Rechavites, right? This group of people who were somehow ethnically different than us and yet were part of who we were and part of our people. So we have that notion. One last thing, it may also sound for familiar, this idea of this red string that would be a sign of, she's going to be saved because she demonstrated that. And we're all familiar with the Kabbalah thing of people take a red string and they tie it around their wrists of their left hand, and that almost becomes like an amulet, right? A way of saying, God, protect me. Originally, the notion of the red string goes back to women who were infertile, barren, unable to conceive and bear children, who went to the tomb of Rachel, who for many years was barren, and they take a red string and they tie it around the tomb, cut it into pieces, and then they wrap around their wrist, they wrap this red string. And that was sort of like an amulet, a way of asking God to please bless them, look down upon them, have mercy on them, help them to get pregnant. And then in recent times, the last 25 years or so, people like Madonna have made Kabbalah an in kind of thing. And many people will wear that, not because they want to conceive and have a child, but it's almost like, a necklace, a chamsa, something that brings you protection. So that's our stories from Shelach Lecha. And we'll break for a few minutes, and 8:30 we'll pick it up with Mari.